Myron, so good to see you. It's been
Hi,
a really
Becky.
long time
It
and
really
very
has.
remiss of me not to have been talking to you for so long. But it's really great you're here. Um, this week, we're going to move on from our sort of first couple of interviews. One was been about just the nature of the challenge, the crisis and the adaptive challenge. And the second is sort of how do you know what the adaptive challenge is? And really, I want us to get into so what do we do once we know, now once we start recognizing the adaptive challenge as it
Mm,
emerges, how are we going to work? What should be, what's going to be our process? What's our leadership work
mm,
in this adaptive context?
right.
But to get us going, it would be really helpful, I think, for our audience, if you could say a little bit about who you are.
Okay. It's Myron Rogers and an old friend of Becky's from a very long time. We've been together. Let's see, I'm always embarrassed saying these things because they sound a bit arrogant, but I was originally in my career, I was part of a international group of people who were really establishing the connection between living systems theory and social organizations. And that was exciting and wonderful work. It led to a fair amount of writing. There's a book, A Simpler Way, that I co-authored with Meg Wheatley many years ago, but is about living systems and how they translate into human organizations, social organizations. My consulting work has been really large-scale change, multiple years with very big clients, global corporations, especially in the high-tech field, lots of those, and then lots of public sector work. And I actually began working in the NHS under John Major. So I'm probably older than many of the people listening to this broadcast right now. But but there you go.
Oh, and of course, we met at the King's Fund, which I'm trying to think was
King's
probably
Fund, right? Yeah, yeah.
even 30 years ago, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
We were just chatting with my son, who always used to call you my American. So
That's
not
right.
just Myron,
When
but
he was
my American.
a very young boy.
He was a
Now
sweetie.
he's a man.
I know he's a man. I know.
Yeah,
Look
yeah,
at his mum, bless him, in this
right,
time.
right.
So we've got up. We've really reason why I reached out to you, Myron, to talk with you is I think you taught me most of what I know about process, about
Wow.
design, about how do you do the work. And we've been concentrating a lot on the what so far. But I know we've got this, as we're moving out of this crisis, we need some principles. We need some things that will guide us in in this relational work. A lot of people who are watching this will know we talk about the
Yeah.
adaptive work being relational work. And so I just wondered if you would just talk to us about the principles that you use when you're trying to do this
Sure.
complex work.
Yeah. It's an interesting challenge to think about what principles you would use and how do you use them. Um, I've been at this a very long time, and one of the things about systems theory, whether it's living systems theory or cybernetics or all the things that people come at, is that it's actually really complex stuff. And you can spend ages just learning it, studying it, and before you start working. And it had seemed to me over the years that that wasn't appropriate. That if living systems theory actually described a reality of how our relationships grow, how our communities grow, how our organizations grow, develop, survive, if any of that is real, then it should be, you should have an embodied experiential sense of that. There should be a truth within you that doesn't actually need a 3-day seminar on living systems theory, right? Which I do lots of, right? And so over the years, I've really paid attention to what makes sense and what doesn't, what's congruent with the theory and what feels supportive in the work, and ended up with this list of, it's only 6 maxims, and I didn't call them that. Somebody named them Myron's maxims, but all of those are they are a very different way of understanding the work. Before I go through them, one thing I wanted to say is about the adaptive work, the adaptive challenge of leadership. One of the things that's going on right now and always goes on is that we do not have access to the information we need. And we don't have access to that information because the people we want to bring to the table are excluded through something you just showed me, Becky, a little while ago, about the structure of power, which is actually the very beginning of my career. I worked with Rosabeth Moss Kanter, and that work was around power dynamics and the structure of power and how it affects diversity and inclusion in organizations. But mostly we simply do not have access to the information that we need to make sense of the world. And the way in which we make sense of the world has results like this, the pandemic.
And that we talked, Irwin and I were talking, as you know, Irwin, and you around power, and but we also know, we talk a lot in the work we do with people. Martin will say, you can't get there from not here. You have to know what's really going on here.
Yes.
And certainly for those of us, it's very interesting being on a sort of outside-inside rather than an inside-inside situation, working from home. We're getting access to data about what's really going on around here in order to make sense of. So if this is it, how do we move on? Is phenomenally difficult at the moment, isn't it?
Yes. Well, and how do you actually invite in that information in a way that it can really be heard? And another thing is I have the gift of being the chair of Lang Kelly Chase Foundation, which is a sizable foundation actually in the UK. And what we're trying to deal with is changing the structures and the systems that keep severe and multiple disadvantage in place, that perpetuate severe and multiple disadvantage. And, that should mean that who's sitting at the table with us are those people who are suffering the impact of severe and multiple disadvantage or the structural dynamics that keep that in place. And they're not at the table. We would be the first to say that they aren't. In the UK, the charity sector is, this is a horrible statistic. In the charity sector in the UK is 99% white, 70% white male. That's those are the board makeup in that. And, in order to change that, it's not a simple thing of saying, let's change who's in this room. It's also changing how we're in the room together, right? It has to be that.
But then we were talking just before we started recording, we were talking about, what are we seeing? Back to so what's really going on around here? And I've just been so incredibly struck by these complete polar opposites that we're seeing, but also the very obvious prevalent. You can see our society, whether it's the amount of women that I talked to on Zoom who are also managing their children, and to be honest, the men less so. The fact that our government briefings and every day all we see is white men. We just see white men. Right. I shared with you this. I just thought this was absolutely fabulous, and I really recommend people just to watch this very short video. I'll put it up on the blog.
Yes, it's
just
great.
About what social distancing means for people of Black and ethnic minority origin, and that they have already felt socially distanced from white people. So and we look at the horror that the pandemic is reaping in our society, and in Britain it is on poor people primarily, and people of Black and ethnic minority origin. So the disadvantages, the stuff we've been saying with Marmot's second review about poverty, all these things are now absolutely in front of us. So when we're talking about a systemic response and engaging everybody in the system, in the solution to the adaptive solution that we need, some of these folks are going to feel very left behind.
Absolutely.
So I think that just being able to get people together in some level of equal space. You're really, really good at how it creates
it's about equal space,
a real equal space.
One of the things that I'm getting a little tired of is I'm hearing over and over again is that we can't return to normal and we won't return to normal. But in fact, the history of power dynamics, of systems, of relational, social systems, is that they want to go back to where they were before. And you can already hear it. And we talked about the United States. You can already hear it in the US, certainly. Trump is certainly going to turn on the spigot way before he should, because he wants things back to normal. He's got an election to win, sadly.
Well, the old power, the old new power dynamics. The old power has got a lot to lose. I listened to Ed Miliband's Reason to be Cheerful podcast and around centralization and decentralization. And I hadn't really thought about it starkly about how centralized the UK is compared to any other national governance system.
Right.
And, here we have this huge rise in localism and people self-organizing. Back to our principles, self-organizing, right, using key principles, everyone having a voice, everyone doing what they can, bringing their assets to bear. Clear what the question is. We were talking last week. Our question is making scrub the NHS. They're very clear on purpose, and yet, how do these folks rise up against a power which will put them right back in the box afterwards if we're not careful? And maybe this is quite a good point to go through your maxims, Myron. Just to,
yes, I think it is. And as an intro to that, though, I just picking up on what you said, Becky, that there is something in the video that you're connecting people to, the Diana Cunningham, I think it is. One of the things she talks about in that is that social distancing is a set of agreements, or the situation that we're in socially is a set of agreements, which I'm sure you know that I agree with that entirely. And to go to the maxims, actually, that's a different set of agreements. And they're ones that are based on how we understand the dynamics of living systems, right? So just quickly, people own what they help create, full stop. I mean, if you just wait, that's like one of those truisms that people, as soon as you hear it, everyone says, yes, of course that's true. Yet we don't work like that, right? Essentially, we work that a few small group of people somewhere develop the answer to something and pass it out to the society, which then takes it up and turns it into its own thing. If you don't involve people in the creative act from the very beginning, or at least some point along the line, open up the process to invite people in with their intelligence, experience, wisdom. If you don't do that, they'll take whatever you give them and turn it back into themselves. And it'll have unending, unintended consequences of the wrong kind, probably. Some quick things. Real change happens in real work. This is not a hypothetical. More often than not, we're trying to do change through workshops or whatnot. But essentially, what this says is, take up the real thing that you're trying to deal with. So if the issue is, how are we together as a group of people that is diverse and has different voices in it, you really have to do that around something that matters. It's not an idea. Those who do the work do the change. That certainly builds off this, but just to move on through these, you want to connect the system to more of itself. That's how you make things healthier. And so the fragmentation that we're talking about in the inclusion issues, I mean, that is a system that's extremely disconnected and doesn't have access to itself. And without that access to itself, again, you're generating unintended consequences. This was the first maxim, and a lot of people take it up: start anywhere, follow it everywhere. It says essentially that you take any piece of work that feels at all significant to you. The moment you begin to work with it, it will start throwing up information that confirms or contradicts what it is you're trying to do, and you really need to pay attention to what goes on there. And then the poetic one is: the process we use to get to the future is the future we get. So the way in which we're working together today will produce an utterly consistent outcome, and things will look, if you're trying to create collaboration through a hierarchical process, what you get is a bastardization of the hierarchy and collaboration at the other end. So
one of the things, back to my scrubs, because it's just so relevant at the moment, with our 55 hours and 100 sets this week. What's really interesting is about so we can just sew scrubs, but it's a new relationship in a system.
It is. And
how do we do it in a way that it isn't that we're providing scrubs to a heroic NHS that doesn't necessarily feel awfully heroic, but also has been so left behind before, to folk who actually need to be taking a leadership position. So it's not a request, it's not, there's a level of what's the reciprocity within it? How do we do this as equal citizens in place? We need you, GPs, you need us. What's the nature of the relationship we're changing, that we can spend longer time changing around health? How do we move it from scrubs to health? So I'm sort of thinking about, you start anywhere, go everywhere. Well, we're starting with scrubs. Where do we take it? If we want it to be something bigger, if we've got 55, plus all the people cutting, plus all the people delivering, plus all the who are working now in service. At one level, it could just be in service to general practice, or it could be in partnership with. And it's just beginning to shift the thinking, well, what's the relationship we're generating here? Or
Yes.
doing a job, you know, and you've got a choice, haven't you?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, for me, there's a couple of things in that. One is there's this issue about information and information having no hierarchy.
Mm.
So that the idea of you being in service to GPs, it's charitable, it's good work,
Yeah,
but it doesn't fundamentally change the relationship, right? It
exactly.
is still one of hierarchy and power dynamics, even if they're positive, you know, generally positive and well-meaning. They can generate outcomes that you don't really want. So that issue of recognizing that, you know, the information we need is everywhere in the system, and it comes in forms that we often don't recognize, and we need to find a way to make that happen.
Mm.
And the relationship piece, you know, I have a number of clients right now, even in the midst of this, that are trying to become integrated health systems, as we know, you know, all these local, all these regional, big complex systems. And one of the things that's happening at the moment is that a lot of things they said they couldn't do for a long period of time, for instance, you know, telemed, all the things that were run, you know, I think that the statistics are 1% of the population practiced GP population practiced telemed before this, and now it's 97%.
Yeah.
So how did that happen overnight? You know, they couldn't do it before. And what people are saying is that this will all stay. And what I'm saying is, no, it won't, not unless you change the dynamic of the relationship. You change the fundamental agreements of who gets to sit at the table about any of these decisions, whose information actually matters, who has a voice and who doesn't, and how do we create the space for all those things to happen? How do we, you know, you can't invite a group of people into a process that's, I was giving my the charitable board that I sit on again, you know, we have our board meetings have a 150-page document before the meeting, right? That people are trying to absorb, and that is a form of whiteness communication. And there are many, many other ways to, and there's lots of information that's missed by communicating that way. There's lots of ways to communicate that are quite different, that would present very different information and therefore different understanding. So
but what that speaks to, Maya, is that so you have a set of principles, but actually design really matters.
it does.
How you set these relationships up, the language you use, the nature,
Yes.
putting these principles into practice. So let's talk a little bit about design, which is, so we've got our adaptive challenge, we understand these principles. I'm starting to think who the system is. Let's have a look at these. Let's have a look at these key sort of design principles, or how to work with the process of design.
Yeah. So over the years, I mean, again, that question about how do you work with the process of design is that's been present to me for a long time, and trying to think of how do you make a system access itself and be available to itself in the process of producing, you know, process and outcomes that they want. So many people, I'm sure, know the World Cafe process, and I sort of bastardized that for this. And it's a design cafe. I've used it for many years. Essentially, you know, getting clear about what it is you're trying to build here. You know, a health system, a local GP practice, a primary care group, something different that you're trying to do. There's basically just 4 questions that you need, and you set it up as a cafe. In other words, different groups working with each question and then mixing that up over time.
Can I just take an example, mine? You could see if you could work it through. So
Yeah.
primary care networks who were beginning to really understand that their role was around meeting complex needs, which were primarily people with with chronic complex comorbidities, or people who had health problems alongside, you know, environmental issues around struggling with life and poverty. So, you know, people begin to scope that, begin to understand who was on their list, who were turning up frequently, etc. So if we take their purpose as sort of meeting complex needs that we can't meet within our GP practice, maybe, I mean, would that
Yeah.
be good enough?
Yes, sure. Well, and as a starting place, that's absolutely good enough. And then, you know, the real issue is, how do people understand the answer to that question together, right? What are we really trying to do? And so in the design cafe, what, as you said before, one of the things is we're clear about the system around this. So as you just described, this, you know, meeting complex needs and who shows up, who doesn't, how do you get those people? How do you identify those people and invite them into a process where they have equal voice? Their information is seen as equal. Because, you know, by the way, in this, while information has no hierarchy, all of our information is insufficient.
Yeah.
My picture of reality is not the right picture of reality. It's a picture of reality. How
That's
do
a lovely way of phrasing it, which is not that I know, or I'm truth, or I've got, you know, that this is so. This is my view of it being.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's my view. Everyone is, you know, essentially an expert over their own process, their own context. But that context normally is is omitted, right? In the hierarchy of thinking about things, those who have power and authority and whatnot, their voice counts more than someone who's at the peripheral, who's often the person being served by that system. So we're trying to bring people together and you know, develop an equal relationship, and you know, focusing on getting clear together about what the purpose of what it is we're trying to do is, getting clear.
So, you know, the sort of the adaptive challenges coming out of or during this pandemic, and not just how do we look after people who've got long-term respiratory damage from ventilators, but also, you know, the sort of how are we going to live our lives now?
Yes.
You know, some really fundamental questions, whether it's
Right.
about the work-life balance, which people are having, you know, have got very extreme examples of at the moment, through to you know, how we distribute our wealth. So we've got some huge questions that could be in this design cafe.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
And,
yeah. You can actually go from the small, from something very specific that you want to design and that you're going to have to execute, to much larger conversations that are ongoing, as you just described.
and it's be interesting, wouldn't it, see which ones the health system chooses to lead on behalf of society, because
Right.
now we've seen some of these real issues. I mean, you know, whether it's the amount of people who are getting COVID because they happen to live in incredibly crowded social housing, which is unreasonable to expect people living in a wealthy, you know, first class society to live in. So with, you know, would it be, so I'm envisaging that we could be doing some of these very immediate sort of challenges around, well, let's talk about people's mental health, you know, in relation to COVID, or whether it's you know, poverty really matters. It really, really matters. Is
Right.
the NHS start having a say and it start taking a lead on that? That could be really fascinating.
I guess my bias, though, is, remember, start anywhere, follow it everywhere.
Yeah, yeah.
So the first thing about some very real concrete challenges, you know, real change happens in real work. Start there. And that will absolutely lead you into the conversation about poverty. Does poverty matter? And should, the other issue I have is, the sponsors of these conversations tend to be the same groups over and over again. They represent the power structure. So there is a big challenging question about how do we actually begin from a place where we are co-designing what the conversation is and how it's going to happen with those who are going to be in the conversation, rather than designing for people that we're going to invite into our process.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so people will always ask, well, where are the public in this? You mean you want the public to be co-designing, and how many? Because usually we like one or two.
Right. Yes. They do ask that. What can I say? The answer is yes, we want the public. And we are the system that we're trying to design for.
Yeah, yeah. So when you've seen this working well, I think people would really like to say, so, okay, so we've sort of got people in a room and we've gone through this and we've worked out our purpose, and we've tried to understand, get behind the context of it. We've worked out who we need. we've got some idea about if we got there, will we know we got there? You know, what's the measurements? Have you got any stories of things that you think of that were you know, I suppose not of this, maybe of this order of difficult, but some really, really challenging contexts where you've had a go at this and it's made a difference?
So this is always, the dreaded question always, you know, do you have examples? Yes, absolutely, have examples. And everything, I would say this, everything I've ever done has ultimately failed. and it's failed in the sense that it just doesn't persist through time and space, right? It persists in it changes, it adapts, it evolves, it moves into a different direction. And you know, you can't say, well, this is what we intended to do, and here's, you know, 4 months later, this is what we got. Because if you're not paying attention to 5 months later, the way in which it changes itself, the very change you're trying to do changes, you know, it's a different thing. I would say the thing that is most important to nourish, to nurture, to make sure it persists is the capacity for doing this, the capacity for having these conversations, for the kind of hospitality or hosting of inviting people into conversations, the ability to have learningful conversations in which we look at what's actually gone on and how it measures up to what it is we're trying to do, whether it works or doesn't, what happens as a result. That those are the things that to persist through time and space. And I think that's happened. You know, somebody we both know, Rob Webster, out there. You know, we and many other people have supported Rob over the years in a lot of things. And if you look at someone, and I don't mean it as an individual, I mean, look at his organizations, what he tries to do with them is persisting in developing that capability for how you change, grow, adapt. That's the real key piece. I would say that I've been successful in that, and the people that I've been successful with doing it often move on to other organizations and start over. Right? So,
Thank you. I think what we've tried to do in this one is just to say, where do you start? And I think we always say you start with these principles of being human together, having a legitimate place to shape your own future is so very important. And right now, I think more than ever, people need to feel that they can make a real contribution to the future, and not just to rescuing what's going on now. So I've really appreciated the conversation, Mai. Thank you so
me
much.
too.